Good afternoon, everybody. Please excuse my voice. I think I've either been screaming too loud or talking too much, so I'm a bit croaky, but I think my wife thinks it's very sexy, so well, I'll see you later. All right. Guys, thanks for attending the session this afternoon. So what I wanted to do is focus on test automation, specifically around the Tricentis TTA, which is obviously the automation tool. And the motive behind this presentation was there's always a barrier to entry to try and go down a new particular field of any sort of technology or innovation. And a lot of people end up saying, yes, it's awesome, we've seen the marketing slides, and everyone's excited, and they go back to the office and they open up their laptop, and they say, well, where do I start? And suddenly, all that excitement and all the wonderful presentations don't get them past that initial keyboard. Where do I start? So what I wanted to do was identify sort of 3 or 4 things around the testing, around the automation, touch on the product, obviously, just in terms of some of the nitty-gritties. And obviously, we can't have a really deep dive, but the idea is to go away and realize that there are 4 or 5 fundamental items or elements that are worth looking for and understanding it's not just a techie tool, it's not only for a business, it's not only for the project, it's sort of a combination of everything. So that was sort of what I want to try and achieve, and hopefully I'll achieve that today, so you can read that offline. So just briefly, just touch on the partnership between SAP and Tricentis. Excuse me. We're looking at testing in general. And then we talk about lean testing or lean documentation because testing is not just one script. It's quite a voluminous amount of information that needs to be processed or utilized by the testing team. So, and that's normally where the stumbling block comes on to say, oh, I've got 500 processes. How do I start, or where do I start? And it becomes sort of insurmountable. So touch on that briefly. And then I'll quickly shoot through a couple of slides on the configuration of the tool. They're not particularly exciting, but if you go down the road, it's some bits and pieces that might be of interest. And then I've got a couple of takeaways that we can focus on. So from a perspective of Tricentis and SAP, I think you've seen a couple of slides, and you've seen Tricentis been mentioned a few times in the slides today. In 2020, SAP and Tricentis got together, and they announced a strategic relationship. And what they decided to do was take a portion of their Tricentis testing engine, as a product set, and create sort of a stripped-down version of it, plug it into the solution manager landscape, and give us the ability to start leveraging off the Tricentis' automation tool set. There is obviously a much bigger product scope. What we're dealing with is just a small element. And 2 elements that we get from this relationship from SAP and Tricentis is the test automation side, covering all the main SAP UIs, which is important. And then for the bit more technical guys, there is a set of APIs that SAP exposed to the world, excuse me, and the tool set is able to do that as well. Why this partnership is important is every time there's new innovation or a new product comes onto the market, there's always got to be a concept of, is my investment going to be protected? And the upside of this is that SAP and Tricentis have pretty much agreed to work quite closely together. It's considered strategic from their behalf. So from an investment perspective or from a time and effort perspective, you generally know that time and energy spent now is not going to get thrown away in 3 years' time just because Tricentis happen to be the flavor of the month. So why Tricentis in the case of test automation? So first of all, the ease of adoption. I know traditionally there was always a test automation using the other tools. There's ECATs, and it gets really, really technical, writing scripts and fiddling with screen attributes, et cetera, et cetera. From a Tricentis perspective, they work on a no-code concept. So what fundamentally comes down to is they've got the modules. They've written the modules. They've got a bit of smart guys behind the scenes. Written modules to manipulate the various UI components. So when your scripters decide to put a set of scripts together, there's no scripting or pseudo-scripting. It's you identify the module that's manipulating a particular part of the screen, and all you need to focus on are the attributes needed for that particular element. So I'll take a simple example. The GUI toolbar, there's an object called the GUI toolbar, and there you talk to say save as an example. I'm just using rough examples here. You basically set the attributes, and the script engine understands the module, understands your input, and it drives the execution. So from a business perspective, there's no need to go into sort of a pseudo-programming environment. From a skill set perspective, it's easier to build a set of skills because it doesn't have to be that technical. Tricentis, why Tricentis? They're pretty much the leading test automation engine. If you look at the Gartner quadrants, they're sitting quite comfortably in the top right-hand corner. And then it's free, because some of the best things in life are free. So, okay. So when I talk about free, I'm talking just about this little TTA engine, right, the test automation agent or test automation engine. Yes, as I said, there's a big Tricentis, Tosca, there's a whole range of products, but for our particular world, from the solution manager perspective, it's included in your enterprise license agreement. So this already removes one of the major barriers to entry, is software procurement. It's there, you can download it, you can start technically using it tomorrow. From a future-proof perspective, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be in a situation where you're spending a lot of time and effort building capability or putting all the scripts together, and then you find that the product is no longer the flavor of the month, and you've got to restart your whole exercise when you decide to adopt a new product. If any of you guys were in Tim's presentation next door, he was talking about migrating from Solman on-prem to cloud. The upside here is that sort of migration path or that sort of movement path is pretty much protected purely because Tricentis is also supported as the nominated test automation engine in the cloud ALM space. So again, time and effort spent, even though we're talking on-prem here, that time and effort spent is not going to get wasted when you eventually start your migration journey to the cloud, to SAP Cloud. And then more is always more. A lot of companies have a lot of invested effort in using CBTA as the automation tool. That work does not get thrown away. Tricentis, or the TTA component, it complements your existing test automation framework. So what you might end up in a situation where you've got a series of CBTA scripts and you now want to adopt the TTA as your tool of choice. It's a case of nominating or identifying the area where you want to start introducing the tool. And then over time, obviously, you slowly sort of deprecate the CBTA scripts and you move across to Tricentis. Or alternatively, you can keep those CBTA scripts running in parallel or in conjunction with the Tosca scripts. Because from solution manager's perspective, when you execute a script, solution manager doesn't care what the test automation engine is. It's just firing off the script. And if the script is controlled by Tricentis or the script is controlled by the CBTA engine, Solman doesn't care. So you can use them integrated as a single solution, and then over time, as I said, you have the option to move CBTA out of your particular focus. So obviously SAP RISE is a topic of conversation here. So I thought I'd throw an SAP slide in here just to put things into context. We know we've got application lifecycle management sitting in the middle, whether it's on-prem or in cloud, doesn't matter. There's a solution that caters for both scenarios. And SAP now, we've seen Signavio come up again also quite a few times. We know it's becoming SAP's sort of standard process design tool set. And obviously on the far side, we've got Tricentis from an automation perspective. And what SAP are trying to put together is giving you this sort of the full business transformation framework from process mapping to the actual orchestration of the life cycle, and then giving you full support from the Tricentis tool set. And then just to remind you, obviously, if your time and energy has been spent here, when you do eventually move across to cloud, and that technology and that concept and that work effort, your designs, your frameworks, migrates across and will serve you well in the cloud ALM. Because we are in a difficult space of transition now. And again, you don't want to go and invest effort, which is considered to be throwaway effort. Hopefully it won't be. And I'd like to think I'm one slide up on Tim. Tim next door mentioned that they've just finally announced that test automation now is integrated into Cloud ALM, and he didn't update his slides. I did. Okay. So if you look at the tool set, we've got the full sort of Tosca framework. What we're concerned about is just the section down the bottom here. We've got the test automation component supporting Solman. If for some reason your testing requirements are far more sophisticated, then yes, there are licensed components or licensed level of the product set that will broaden the scope of what you can do with the product. What we're focusing on from a free perspective is how that agent integrates into Solution Manager and gives us that automation execution without any additional cost. And then from going across onto the cloud ALM side, it is the behind-the-scenes testing engine that SAP have agreed with. The reason why they can do this is just from a design and from an architectural perspective. The test suite inside Solution Manager remains pretty much untouched. We haven't integrated TTA and rewritten the source code inside Solution Manager. TTA sits as a separate piece of software. What Solman's doing from a test suite perspective, it's allowing us to manage our tests. Create your test packages, create your test plans, allocate your testers. Do what you need to do, whether it's manual or automated. But when the time comes to do the execution, Solman hands control over to the Tricentis toolset. That's where the execution takes place, and then brings all the information back into Solution Manager. So Solution Manager becomes your starting point and the resulting reporting point. The execution, they've handed over completely to Tricentis, and it keeps the integration very simple, and that you don't have a situation where you've got half your effort sitting in Solman, half your effort sitting outside Solman, and the data's sort of messed up. So they've kept it quite segregated, which works for us. All right, so testing in general. Sorry, can I get a bottle of water? Sorry, can you just bring me some water? Thanks. So testing in general, excellent, thanks very much. I said this stating the obvious. A couple of lessons I've learned over the last year is that what you consider to be common knowledge isn't always common knowledge. So I'm going to state the obvious, and then you decide if you consider it to be common knowledge or not. So manual testing and automated testing, what is the difference? So manual testing is where we get the humans involved. Someone's got to sit at the desk, and he's got to go and punch a bunch of buttons or menus, and he's probably following a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, telling him exactly what to do. Test automation, we generate scripts. And the scripts will obviously get replayed on the particular desktop, and it'll mimic the user action. That's pretty much what it is. So the trick is, do we go completely automation, and do we still need manual testing? Yes, you still do need manual testing, because not every single process is going to be run on a high volume, on a regular scheduled environment. Sometimes testing just needs to be run once or twice. It serves its purpose, and it can pack away. So there's definitely still a need for manual testing. From an automation perspective, what it gives you is you suddenly have an opportunity here where you can execute thousands of lengthy test scripts, and which is almost impossible for a user team to work with. And the nice thing is it's accurate, it's repeatable, and it's reliable. So there's definitely a room for manual with a slow shift to automation. What a lot of companies are doing is they obviously have their scope for the manual testing, and over time, each time they go through a major test cycle, whether it be regression testing or patching, whatever the story might be, what you slowly start migrating those manual scripts into an automated environment. And so it's not going to be sort of a big bang. Let's say we've got 500 scripts, manual scripts. You're not suddenly going to automate all 500. We'll take a small set, assuming those processes are stable and they are critical enough that they require the effort. And then you move those across into the automation space and then leave some core manual ones behind until the effort justifies their movement into a automated environment. Because remember, when you start building your automation scripts, you don't wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to write scripts today. You've got to come from some point, and the journey point that you come from is going to be your library of manual test cases. You're probably going to give that information to the script writers and say, here's a manual test case, please write me a script and start automating it. So it is a component. So manual testing is still very, very much alive. It's not going to go away in a hurry, but what we want to try and do is obviously shift the laborious, repetitive tasks across, and the more fundamental once-off tests will remain as manual effort. Okay, so a couple of benefits. First of all, I need to drink some water. Okay, so some fundamental benefits from a testing perspective. Sorry, guys. Back on. There we go. All right, let me back. Okay, luckily I had a blank slide. Otherwise, you guys have read my whole slide, and then I would have had to talk. All right, so benefits of test automation. So from a simple perspective, and these are quite obvious items, but actually sometimes overlooked, user time. When it starts looking at a testing exercise, From an automation, you're definitely going to start reducing the time and effort needed, and obviously you reduce the size of your team needed to test. People can't afford to go and spend 4 to 6 weeks twice a year trying to run regression tests if there's been a major technical patch or a major functional change. So the minute you start moving into automation scope, you're taking a traditional, let's say, a 2-hour testing cycle, and you can effectively reduce it down to almost 20 minutes, 15 minutes. All right, so there definitely is a cost benefit and a time benefit. What's also happened is, we all know the landscape that we operate nowadays has become far more sophisticated, and the need for change is actually quite dramatic. If you look at some of the change managers and the pressure they are under to release stuff into the production system, that time window is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. We can't have a situation where we're doing one innovation release a year and we can have 3 months of testing. We need to, these things want to come out almost weekly, 2 weekly, 3 weekly changes. And so the opportunity to automate the critical processes, or the ones that are high volume elements, allows us to dramatically reduce that time window. The nice thing about scripting, it's iterative, it's repeatable, and it's stable. What typically happens with this is, if you've got a bunch of manual test cases and it's Friday afternoon and the tester has to get 46 test scripts done, he's not paying much attention to his effort. He's more concerned about the Friday afternoon quitting time. So his result on his test effort might be not quite the same had it been, let's say, 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, where he had the whole week to get through his work. So do you trust the outcome from a manual test? Predominantly you do. But the trick is, from an automation perspective, it's the same results. It's constantly wrong or it's constantly right, irrespective of who runs the script. And then obviously the nice thing is it's repeatable. So that might sound sort of trivial. Yes, it's repeatable. Most of you have probably been in projects where you're probably doing like a regression testing or some sort of UAT. Okay, obviously not UAT, but let's say regression testing. And you wish to test something. Now suddenly you've got to go find the 5 people needed, get them in a room, and start the process. And not everybody's available at the same time. The nice thing is, when you start bringing scripts into the equation, you don't need anybody. The script is there, it's been built, it's ready to run, and it's a case of running it, waiting your, depending on the length of the script, waiting 10, 15 minutes, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, doesn't matter, and you get your result immediately. There's not running around trying to assemble a quick testing team. From a risk reduction and auditable perspective, because we are running these scripts in a structured tool set, there's accountability, there's recordability. Are there such words? I think recordability is maybe not a word. But the nice thing is, at any point in time, your auditors or your risk or governance guys can go and look at the logs and see exactly which sets of scripts were run, on which day, which time, and what was the ultimate result. So if there is ever a situation in production, there's an opportunity to come back and say, was it bad testing? Was it insufficient scope? What actually went wrong? So, and that gives us that nice traceability. And then finally, from our side, obviously testing transparency. And the key word down the bottom there is no spreadsheets. There are, obviously I'm definitely talking from a perspective of solution manager. You've got the dashboards, you've got the reports. That should be the final tracking mechanism, not take the pretty pictures of Cellman, put it into a spreadsheet, manipulate the scope a little bit, take a couple of percentages out, and then present a glorious picture, and then only to discover 2 weeks before you go live, you've only tested a third of your project. So the idea behind this is create that system of record, remove the spreadsheets out of the equation, and have a more trusted platform to work with. Okay, so the pieces of the puzzle. Coming back to Solution Manager, I don't know if any of you have seen the slide in the last several years, but it's sort of a high-level summary report, a summary slide on the capabilities inside Solution Manager, specifically around the testing. And we obviously, from a testing perspective, we obviously do have to go one step back before we start testing, and that's going back into processes. Why do we have to go back into business processes? Because that gives us business context. We're not just having a spreadsheet with a list of 400 scripts, all considered in isolation with no context relevance. By putting in the business processes, we have business context and we understand the scope. From the test case perspective, a combination of manual tests and automated tests. From a test plan management, we have test plans broken up into packages. We can introduce sequences if we wish to, and then obviously we assign it to the various testers. From a tester perspective, they'll be responsible working off their work list. They'll do the manual testing. If there are automated tests, they'll push through the automation. And if there are defects, we can obviously manage the defects. And then something that is quite often overlooked are the analytics. Test Suite in Solution Manager has a fairly, very comprehensive set of reports to help the test managers and the change managers track their progress and their scope of the testing exercise. So that's pretty much the standard Test Suite components, and then obviously the automation portion fits inside the automation framework. Yes, there are other products that fall within that framework, but for the sake of this exercise, I'm focusing on the Tricentis piece. So where do we start with this process? So I mentioned earlier we start with a lean game. You can't come into the world and say, I've got 500 scripts, I want to automate them all, and then we suddenly realize, oh, hang on, every single script is connected to a business process. We suddenly have to go and map the entire business. And suddenly I want to do something very simple here, but I've got to go 10 steps back, which makes up huge amounts of people, effort, time, and suddenly that small gain just doesn't justify the upfront effort. So there are quicker ways to get going. I think most of you might have seen the solution documentation screen on the right. We know that inside Solution Manager, we obviously break down processes into a breakdown hierarchical structure. And at the lowest level, or at a process level, or at a process step level, this is where we store the manual test cases, or we upload the test configurations. For those who aren't familiar, the manual test cases would be a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. It's whatever media you wish to record the information. I'm not talking focus, build, and test steps here. I'm just using a simplified exercise here. The test configurations, all you're uploading into Solution Manager is basically metadata to say a script exists with this name, and this is its purpose. During the creation of that test configuration, it then will fire off the Tosca toolset. It will create a folder, and that will be the test case. And from a testing perspective, the script gets written on that side. Nothing gets stored in Solution Manager. The testing stays inside the Tosca toolset. So a couple of things to think about when you start looking at lean documentation. If you have something, fantastic. If you don't, come up with a scalable naming convention. I think most of you might have seen the various SAP best practice. There's APQC, hierarchical process structures that are industry standards. Most people go with a 1.1.1 or a 10.10.5. It's some sort of structured naming convention. Come up with a naming convention that is scalable. Because you might not be mapping the entire business, you might only be mapping a small portion for a particular initiative, but whatever naming convention you adopt, make sure it can support the wider business. From a processing mapping perspective, there are a couple of choices here. Some companies do have processes mapped in some form or another, in some mapped end drive that nobody can find. What I've seen on one customer, they had nothing. And then out of the blue, someone said, yes, but we did a regression test 6 months ago, and we have a spreadsheet. That's fine. That's a good starting point. You have a spreadsheet of all the manual test cases with the process associated with it. So you've got something to take out the business, and you've got a starting place. So if available, use past cycle test spreadsheets. But again, you don't want to go and map the entire business. You just want to map just what you need to solve this initial testing initiative. And then at a later point in time, you obviously scale as you can bring on more and more components of the business. And then as I mentioned in a couple of slides back, the reporting. The reporting is very, very powerful. So the rule is you don't know what you're missing. However, ensure what you do have is correct. So again, you don't know that you've mapped every single process in the organization. That's a whole different discussion. But if you've only mapped 10 processes, then make sure that those 10 processes are correct. And if you are going to do testing across those 10 processes, then make sure those 10 processes either have a manual test case or a test automation script. So you know that what you have is complete. And if you don't know what you don't know, then it's a case of having a look at the reporting that Solution Manager gives us from a test suite perspective. See the kind of data it gives you, and then determine, is that report valuable to me? And if it is, make sure that the components of test suite that you decide to use are deployed inside the organization so that those reports are meaningful. Otherwise, all you're going to be doing is you're going to put a bunch of processes in, put a couple of scripts in, people are going to randomly run scripts, and then someone's going to take a spreadsheet to try and figure out what was the effect of that test exercise. Okay, and as I said, start with something very simple. Don't go and map the entire business. But what this will do for you, it will start setting the mindset as to say, this is what we need to do if we want to scale testing into a much larger world. Your naming convention is structured. You understand where you're getting your data from, and as each initiative comes online, if you've got nothing, I'm talking now no processes, then that initiative will have processes because they know what they're building. Bring that information in, document it, and use that as the home to store your documents. Then you've got your business processes mapped. You've got a basic starting point. It might only be 5 processes, could be 10 processes. Now we start moving across into test suite, and we need to make this as simple as possible. So once again, a naming convention. I'm talking here naming conventions for what we call a test plan. And it might include something like a minor release or a major release. It might involve a UAT or regression testing or some functional acceptance testing. Come up with a structured naming convention. And it's more important here than anywhere else. The reason being is how often do you do regression testing? It's never just a once-off exercise. You might decide to do a regression testing exercise